So welcome everybody. This is virtual reality in the web browser with WebVR. My name is Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. So over the last year, I've done over 200 interviews with some of the leading developers and academics at about 6 or 7 different conferences around the world. So I just sort of go and talk to people about VR a lot. And in the course of that, I've had a chance to do 5 different interviews now about WebVR. Vlad Vukićević, he's the guy who created WebGL, as well as Tony Parisi. He's somebody who has written books about WebGL. He also was one of the leaders of VRML back in the day. I had a chance to talk to them back at DevsignerCon about a year ago, which was like the first big consumer VR conference. And then after that, WebVR came out just a month or 2 after that. And then I had a chance to talk to Josh Carpenter, who's also on the team with Vlad, and then Brandon Jones, who is at Google. He's in charge of integrating a lot of this same stuff into the Chrome web browser. And so I haven't actually implemented and done a lot of the actual code of WebVR. I went through these 2 technical presentations from Tony Parisi and Rudy, but I'm just hoping to kind of give you a high level of what you need to know to kind of go off and start to play with this stuff. So if there's more technical questions, I recommend sort of looking up documentation online, but I can certainly talk about VR design. I've had a chance of creating at least 4 different experiences now and talk to a couple hundred people about it. So I can certainly field a range of lots of questions in the field of VR in general. So there's this quote by Chris Milk, which is really great. He says, talking about virtual reality is like dancing about architecture. So until you actually have a chance to experience it, it's kind of hard to explain by just words. So again, if you do have a chance to come up and try it out, please do, because otherwise it's just sort of like theory. But VR has a capability of tricking your subconscious mind into believing that you're in another world. And there's 2, they call it presence. There's 2 key components of presence. It's the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. The place illusion is just that you feel like you're in another world. This does this really great. But the plausibility illusion, that's the other component. That's where you feel like you can actually impact and have an impact on the world. And without input solutions, you kind of feel like a ghost a little bit. So in this experience, you're just going to be able to look at the world but not really feel like you're in the world. A lot of the solutions with HTC Vive, with input controls that have tracked by lasers, that's when you feel like you really get that extra level of presence. And that's what came out at GDC this year and kind of blew everybody out of water. And just at E3, Oculus came out with their 6 degrees of freedom, or 6 DOF controllers called Oculus Touch, which is going to be launching early next year. But those 2 things of creating a sense of place and having an impact on that are sort of the 2 key components of presence for virtual reality. And until you really experience it, it's hard to really describe. So this is kind of like, from the perception standpoint, it's still kind of awkward to do VR in public. Especially if you haven't had a chance to actually experience VR, because it kind of looks ridiculous to be wearing HMD. And that's a clip from Wall-E where just people are kind of just jacked into their media. So there's a perception, but yet once you actually get a chance to experience VR, then you kind of have that awe factor of the wow. So I think as time goes on and people get a chance to actually be in VR, they're going to get a sense of like what it actually feels like to be inside an experience. And so that stigma, I think, will not be as high. But there's this other sort of perception that when you're in VR, you're just going to like jack in and you're not going to want to do anything. You're just going to sort of like, I think this picture is called like the future WoW player. So in the future, we'll all be just sort of like just hunkered down and jacked into VR all the time. But the thing that I've learned is that it's actually a very social medium. When Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook bought Facebook, he said, Oculus has the potential to become the most social platform ever. And this is a scene from Converge, which is a low poly kind of place for people to come and hang out. And there's not a lot of body language that you can apparently see from a head, but when you can track where people are looking, and it's just like you get head nods, you get an amazing sense of knowing that there's a person behind this. It's not an NPC or a robot, that there's an actual human there, and where they're looking is actually where they're looking. And so you have these situations where the social component of the web, you're able to communicate a lot more body language, and it's in a lot of ways bringing back a lot of what social media has flattened in terms of all the context and body language and nonverbal communication. That's all coming back with VR, and so we have the chance to really bring back a lot of the humanity into technology, which I find really compelling and interesting. And it's really going to be the thing that makes VR stick and be really compelling, which is part of the reason why Facebook paid $2 billion for Oculus, because they saw that. So when thinking about VR design, you got to think about, like, when you have a website, what would it mean to have kind of like a meeting of people here? Because that's kind of where it's going. Alex Chu, who used to be the designer of the Milk VR, which is at Samsung, it's kind of like the Oculus Home interface. He talks about, like, you're designing a sense of place rather than just looking at something on a 2D screen. It's more of an architectural problem where you're actually in a 3D space and you have to think about things in that way, more of an architect rather than just a 2D designer. And so architecting spaces for social interactions or different experiences, I think, is where this whole immersive technology is going. So the sci-fi literature has actually had this figured out for a long time. You look at Snow Crash or Ready Player One, it's all about people running around interacting with other people in these virtual worlds. And Vlad Vukićević, he said that the web is the metaverse, it just has a 2D interface. And so if we look at VR apps today, we can see that you have to download something from a platform. It's usually a proprietary, like, you have to be approved to get on there. People can get downloads that they just put up on Mega or whatnot, but I think in the future it's going to get more and more like the iPhone, where it's going to be trickier to get things onto the platform. You have all these platform players that are trying to lock things down. It's going more towards that direction rather than having everything open. Everybody kind of wants to own the App Store. So that's sort of the downfall of the trajectory of where things are going. You have to download a huge thing, put it on your computer. You have to install the app before you can even run it. You have to, in order to create a VR experience, there's Unity, which has a free version, but yet that's all closed source. Then there's Unreal Engine, that's all open source, but yet they'll take 5% of your profits of anything that you create. So it's less like just create whatever you want and no one cares. It's more of like, there's people who have a lot of interest in kind of locking things down. And it has more of a closed culture at the moment with a lot of gamers. There's not a lot of sharing of assets at this point. And you have to have a lot of expertise in terms of creating 3D models and the whole Maya. Blender is an alternative for creating 3D assets, but a lot of people there's a lot of expertise in things you have to get in order to get up and running. That said, there's also asset stores in Unity and whatnot, but this is just sort of in general. And also web apps today, so you have the capability of having instant access to that. There's no gatekeepers. You can put up whatever you want, and there's no one that's going to say no to you. You can put it up immediately. You don't have to wait to be approved. You can choose whatever tools that you want. There's more of a culture of collaboration. You can share your source code, and there's no barriers to entry. That sounds amazing. So what's the catch? So right now, there's a lot of simulator sickness. So doing things on the web is not as good as doing it on the app at this point, and that's going to remain that way for quite a while. There's a lot of issues when it comes to performance and simulator sickness that, in talking to a lot of the people who are actually building the browsers, they're in the process of re-architecting the browser from the, I don't want to say from the ground up, but they're trying to optimize it so that we will be able to do real-time immersive technologies at 90 frames per second through a web browser. Things are going that way, but they're not there yet, so it'll take a while. So simulator sickness is real. You need to be able to keep high frame rates, 60 to 90 frames per second. There's a lot of lag. So in the VR world, they talk a lot about latency. So if you just imagine, looking at something and you turn your head to the side, the time that it takes for the things to actually catch up to that head movement, you want it to be about 20 milliseconds is the target for Oculus. And things on the web are anywhere from 60, 80, 100 milliseconds, which is, pretty bad. Sometimes you can be into an experience and it's okay, it's tolerable, but if people are whipping their head around, or it just has the capability, it has the possibility of making people sick subtly. Motion sickness is something that kind of creeps up on you, and you don't notice it until it's already too late, and then you're done. And as things get harder, and more and more graphic fidelity, that's just going to be more and more trickier. So I'll talk a little bit more of the challenges later. So right now, a lot of the VR development community are focusing on these two tools. I'd say about 90% of all the VR development is happening within Unity. And then if the Unreal Engine is the things that are like the super highly polished, they look really beautiful. That's the things that Oculus and the AAA game studios use, but it's much more optimized for people who really know what they're doing in terms of the 3D. And both of them are having the capability output to WebGL, which means that you could take whatever you create in Unity and publish it to all the platforms of the iPhone and for the VR world, it's the Oculus and Morpheus and HoloLens, and Unity is basically becoming the lingua franca of the immersive technologies. But eventually into the web. The only problem is right now when you publish to WebGL, you used to have to download a plugin to do that, but now, even though it's HTML5, you still have to wait for it to load. So you're sitting there for a loading screen to actually go in. So you just have to, there's not a lot of dynamic streaming assets where, we're kind of used to on the web, you push go and you're good to go, but that's not the case yet for this. So that's the kind of the downside of using that. But this is kind of like an overview of all the big players of the virtual reality world right now. Of course, the big one upper left is the Oculus Rift. That's the CD, well, that's the DK2 or the Crescent Bay prototype there. The CD1 was just announced. That's coming out in the spring. Gear VR is what's over there. That's the big launch is going to come in the fall. That's going to be like the first big thing. Sony Morpheus is the first half of next year. That's in the middle. That's going to be on the console. The Google Cardboard, which some people say is a joke, but I've actually talked to the people and they've never really considered it a joke. It's more of a minimum viable product. It's like the absolute minimum thing you would need to do to have a VR experience. And they've delivered over 1 million of these, and they have a lot of big plans for VR. And if you look at what they're doing with VR on the web, you can think about like the Google Cardboard is going to be much better suited for having an ephemeral web experience than any of these other type of HMDs, because it could be something that you just have your phone, you take your cardboard, or you're going to something fold up in your pocket, and you take it out, and you're able to be right there into a virtual world. That's especially for videos and photospheres with Google Maps, and I expect a lot of things to come out from Google with VR. In fact, Brandon just tweeted me right before this that he was hoping to have it in the main line of Google Chrome to have WebVR support, but it's not there yet. OSVR is kind of like the open source version. It's really terrible right now in terms of the technology, but I expect to get it better over time. It's kind of like the typical open source where it kind of lags behind, but eventually gets on par with the other ones. And then HTC Vive is from Valve, and that's a little bit more room scale. You're able to kind of walk around the full room. Now, in terms of the web, I expect that Gear VR is going to be fairly locked down. There's going to be an app store. Maybe there'll be a browser. And Oculus said they're going to be pretty open, but the more they dig into it, it's more moving down to the platform model. They're going to have their own app store, and then maybe they have this partnership with Microsoft, so maybe like the Xbox. And then, of course, the PS4 is going to be totally locked down. Who knows if they're going to have a web component. Valve seems to be probably one of the more open approaches, so I'd expect things to go with the web there as well, but also it's probably going to be like even more expensive than Oculus. They say Oculus, you need about $1,500 of gear, and the Vive is probably going to be around $2,000, $2,500, I'd expect, with their full room scale solution. So it's going to be a little bit more of the hardcore gamers. So that's sort of like an overview of the ecosystem and the different HMDs, which stands for the head-mounted displays. You'll see a lot of HMD language when you look at the actual WebVR code. So let's take a quick look about how a virtual reality scene is constructed. So this is just looking at Unity, where you have a scene, you have a camera, you have a light, and you have objects. And so those are the basic components that you need to create immersive content. And it's like when you look at the API for WebVR, it's going to be the same thing. And the camera, for actually creating a virtual reality experience, we have two eyeballs, and they're offset by our interpupillary distance, which ranges from 64 to 70 to 80 or 75 millimeters or whatnot. So they literally just put two cameras in the scene that are that far apart, and then when they render it out, that's what you see. So this is kind of like a visualization of that. Like if you shut one eye, when there's things that are really close to you that within 1.5 meters that your hand kind of jumps back and forth, and that's the stereoscopic effect that our eyes are doing. So these things are basically reproducing that. It's kind of like the ViewMaster. And so this is a picture of like a 3D camera that's out there that actually just has that offset, so that when they produce it, then they have a way to kind of bring those two images back together. So this is kind of what it looks like. If you were to take off the screen and see what's actually happening behind the screen, it's basically just splitting out the screen right down the middle, putting two renderings from each of those cameras there, and have a distortion. And the distortion, if you look at they have the barrel distortion, so they have to distort it because the phone is only this big, and then they're trying to recreate a field of view that's like 100 degrees. Or in some cases like 210 degrees, but for most, it's around 90 to 110 degrees or so for most of the field of view. And so the lenses have a pinpoint distortion, and then the two cancel each other out, so that when you actually see it, it looks like it's flat, and you feel like you're actually in the world. And so when you're looking through the lenses, you see and feel like you're in a 3D world. And so this scene, just going back to the Unity, is like, here's what that looks like from above with all the different lights and everything. So whenever you're creating immersive experiences, that's, you're basically creating these 3D worlds and just throwing a camera in there and then rendering it out. So your browser already does 3D. It's WebGL. It's on all the mobile browsers, all the desktop and mobile browsers. And so soon it'll also do VR as well. So there's something called the WebVR API. It has the head tracking, so that it's actually taking input from an HMD that you have on your head, and as you move your head around, it's like moving the camera that's in that 3D scene. So it creates that illusion as you're in that 3D environment, and you have to be able to actually take control over the full screen, because with these VR headsets, you're essentially treating it like another monitor. It's a monitor that you're just outputting it, and you're just putting the scene out there, and it just looks like this barrel distortion, and then when you look at it, you feel like you're in the other world. So right now they're in the sort of the nightly experimental builds, but soon they're going to be in the mainline. If the commit would have gone through, it would already be in sort of the main Chrome support, so that you could go and actually start to see these VR experiences. So we don't have to do all big app downloads anymore. We can watch our cat videos in VR, and we don't have to download an app, because who wants to keep the video? If you imagine, if you go to YouTube and if you imagine downloading and storing every video you've ever watched on your hard drive, people don't do that, but yet they watch a ton of videos. And so there's going to be a range of VR experiences that are kind of like that, just sort of quick, ephemeral things that we see, but yet we don't want to have them stored on our hard drive. And right now the model is whatever you experience in VR, you have to kind of like keep it on your device forever. So this is MozVR, which is the Mozilla kind of landing page for their WebVR, and they have a number of different demos on there, which are pretty cool, worth checking out. You'll see there on the right-hand side, it has this warning that says, your browser does not support VR. So you can imagine a time and a place in the future where you visit a website and you see these little goggles or an icon somewhere, and they would indicate to you that if you press that, you would suddenly go into a fully immersive 3D experience of that website. And so if you download the Firefox nightly and install the plugin, then this changed into a little thing that says ready to go. And so there's a thing called virtual desktop, and there's a video blogger, his name's D, his channel name's Everyday VR. And so in the future, you can imagine a time when we're browsing the web with our virtuality HMD on, and we just have maybe a lot of browsers there, and then you just click a button and you go into VR. So here's an example of that. You can see he's kind of looking around. There's a web browser right in front of him, and it's on a spherical plane that makes a little bit better UI. He clicks on the button there, and as he clicks on it, it overtakes his entire field of view. So as he's looking around now, he's completely surrounded by this scene of flying through over a lake. So you can imagine, like, in the future, you may not have a virtual desktop. You may just come to a website and you're like, ooh, there's a 3D version. You click on it and you put it in your Google Cardboard, or you put on your HMD, and now you're in a fully immersive environment generated all through the open web standards. So what is WebVR? Well, first of all, it's not going to do any of the 3D heavy lifting. WebGL is going to still be doing that, and that's the framework to do all your 3D graphics. And most people are using THREE.JS, which is the interface to be able to do that level of 3D graphics. So that's the sort of abstraction library that a lot of people are using. It's a device interface, so it's going to be able to detect your HMD that you are connecting, and it's being able to get the position. So with With the Gear VR, you just have the basically like 4 or maybe 2 dimensions, like left, right, up, down. And then with the Oculus, you have positional tracking. So it's actually like you can lean forward and it's getting all that positional data and the XYZ coordinates. And so you can take that same coordinates and put it into your experience on the web and then recreate that sense of having that full positional tracking within your web environment. So there's a couple of commands there for getting the VR devices. And so as you get a VR device, there's 2 different types. So the position sensor device, so anything that's being tracked in 3D space, there's both the HMD that's on your face, but it could also be 6 degrees of freedom controllers or leap motion. So you'll be able to track like your hands as well as rather than just your head. And then the HMD VR device is something, the surface that you're actually outputting the VR scene to, the barrel distorted rendered scene. So something that gets positional data and has a surface drawn that sounds a lot like a phone. Or within the HMD, it just has the same kind of phone interface. So you tap the HMD, delivers the position data to your app. The app sort of renders that out and it sends it back, and it's in a stereoscopic barrel distortion, and then people are suddenly immersed into the 3D. That's the idea. So we'll jump into a little bit of code. Again, this is directly from Tony Parisi. By the way, whenever you see the style of the presentations change, it's usually because I'm pulling directly from that presentation. So if you wanted to go back and look at some of these more detailed full presentation, then that's Tony's browser-based virtual reality with HTML5. So just at a high level, I'm not going to go through all the specifics here, but you're essentially, this is like a raw, like if you were to query the WebVR API directly, which most people aren't doing this. They're mostly getting it from the THREE.JS library. But essentially, you have, you're asking what devices are available. Is there an HMD? Is there a position there? And then from there, you're able to kind of break out the left and right eye camera positions. And then you have to be able to put it into full screen mode. So, so this is just basically some of the code that you would do to do that. And then head tracking to be able to actually get the head tracking device. And then basically querying the HMD position, and then you're translating it to your camera within the scene. So that's just kind of like a code example of that. Again, this is sort of like the raw code. But there's another presentation by Rudy Jacklin called Getting Started with VR and with JS. It's at Empire.js, and he kind of has some code examples and uses the THREE.JS library. It's a little bit simpler than some of that involved code there. But this is an example of what he's going to create in this example. You can see that he's turning the HMD left and right, and in the scene he just has like a simple polygon that's like rotating, it's moving around. There's a blue kind of plane that has a light within the scene. So again, it's a scene, it has a camera, it's got objects within it, and it's got the camera that's moving around, and it's connected to the HMD. So he's got this HTML. The big thing to point out here are these 2 scripts. There's the THREE.js and then the other NoVR.js. So he's creating a renderer, and then he's creating the scene, and then the light. So again, the 3 things that I was talking about, you'll see a little bit later, he's kind of passing the renderer and he's passing the camera and the scene into the renderer later. And again, this presentation is not so much for you to absorb all this, just get the high level of what he needs to do to actually create this. So there's a scene, there's a light, there's a renderer. He's creating the objects. So if people are familiar with THREE.js, there's all different ways of creating all sorts of different 3D objects with that geometry. He's creating the plane that's there. So that's all that code there. And then he's making it dance around and move around. He's moving that object around. And so all that sort of is what it took to kind of get that very basic scene together. But you can start to see with THREE.js what you could start to do in terms of doing some, simple, lightweight. You don't need to know Maya. You don't need to know a lot of the 3D modeling. You just need to know how to create these 3D environments, and then use some of this THREE.js code, and then all of a sudden you put a little icon on your website, and you're able to put people into an immersive experience. So there's some other different controls and effects that Rudy says that nearly all the WebVR demos use. And Tony actually says in his presentation that some of these may actually be dependent upon the specific HMD. So with each virtual reality HMD, there's different barrel distortion effects, and so you could just imagine that, like, in order to render it out properly, you have to know what device you have because it has to kind of match that. So you're basically, these are kind of like the high-level ways of kind of pulling that and making sure that whatever you're rendering is actually going to fit that HMD and actually look correct. So the VR controls is handling, that's just kind of like the helper function to get all that positional data and to do that, and the VR effect is what you're actually rendering it out to do the stereoscopic effect. And this is actually, instead of doing both cameras, it's actually just treating it as one camera because, you just need to know the relative, it's like a wrapper around those two cameras, and so it just makes it a little bit simpler than having to deal with each eye. So a thing I wanted to point out here is the 360-degree videos. I think are going to be pretty huge. In order to create some of these, they have different, Google just came out with Jump. There's a lot of people use GoPros, and they have 3D printed sort of things to be able to put like 6 to 12 GoPros. And then there's software like Color that GoPro bought to be able to stitch it all together. And then you create this sort of like flattened out view, but then again, it uses a web player to then kind of wrap it into a sphere around you. And so sometimes it's monoscopic, sometimes it's stereoscopic. There's not been a lot of people that really figured out stereoscopic video yet because there's a lot of challenging problems with when you actually like change if you like lean to the side, you break it because the camera is not leaning and it's only captured that, so it really only works when you're turning your head left and right. But 360-degree videos, YouTube's already been making a lot of moves. There's another startup called Viridio and also Little Star. So I think they're going to see a lot more people with 360 cameras and phones to be able to take pictures, and you're going to want to like put people into that full scene. So that's happening more and more. But so yeah, there's a THREE.JS and LVR as a web player that a lot of people have been using as well. So let's talk a little bit about interaction, because I talked a bit about the place illusion, the plausibility illusion. In order to actually feel like you have coherence, you have to have agency and that you're actually participating in the world. So there's going to be lots of HTML objects with the keyboard, mouse, and gamepad, but the Leap Motion is one input device that, when we look at the overall VR ecosystem, it'll be kind of interesting to see if Leap Motion is going to actually stick around, because there's not a lot of other people that are using inside-out cameras where the camera's actually mounted to the HMD. But what that basically gives you is that you can, as you put your hands out and you move your head around, you can be able to track your hands relative to your head, which makes it feel like you can put your hands within the experience. A lot of the controllers that people are using with the Oculus, they have a camera-based solution, but the camera's on the table, and they have like sensors on the cameras, and it's more of an ergonomic solution. The Vive and Lighthouse, they use lasers, and they've got 2 laser base stations, and you're able to move your hands around. So we'll see over time if those 6 degree of freedom controllers, if those get more and more integrated. I imagine that they will, but for right now, Leap Motion is kind of on the leading edge for embracing WebVR, because they're working directly with THREE.JS. And the same sort of like approach with the Leap Motion is they have a series of different JavaScript. They have their own libraries to be able to integrate with their Leap Motion sensor, and different actual function calls to be able to call where those hands are and to be able to actually render them out in the scene. So this is an example of a demo that I saw at GDC. It really blew my mind, because you could see the hands there, and as he's putting his hands in there, it's just distorting this face. And you see he's just like poking around, and it's like, if you've never had your hands in a VR experience, it's like pretty amazing. And I wish I would have had more time to actually set it all up, but it is fairly laggy, and there's the downside of having your first VR experience be like not best in terms of all the optimal performance, because this is running out of the web browser. It gives you kind of an idea of what's possible to do when you're just rendering out with the THREE.JS, and being able to have your hands in there and actually interact with the environment is really super compelling. So I'd imagine as we think about the future of VR on the web, this is going to become more and more vital to make sure that you don't feel like a ghost, you don't just like looking at an experience, that you're actually like participating in some way. So WebVR and Cardboard, they actually have like VR Chrome experiments.com. So if you do have a Google Cardboard, you can put your phone in and go there and start to see some of those experiences. I think that of all the different HMDs that are out there, Cardboard is probably the one that is going to be integrating with the web the most. It probably is going to be the one that's going to be the leading edge in terms of creating different, Google Maps already has photospheres for Street View, so there's ways for you to go into the Google Maps and kind of make it feel like you're on the street anywhere in the world. They have that integrated already, so it's just going to, I think, more and more they're going to have integrations with YouTube, and more of their apps are going to be more VR friendly. And what else? So THREE.JS, again, this is just another call out from. This is from Tony. He's saying that the stereo effect is more for Cardboard and the VR effect is for the Rift. So as you're starting to develop for this, I just look into the APIs and just make sure that you're not just targeting one of the HMDs, but you're doing it in a way that's able to handle all of them. So a lot of this is still very experimental. If you were to start downloading the WebVR, it's still changing. It hasn't been locked down. So just keep track of that. In terms of, as things get into the main browsers, I think it'll start to firm up. But when you think about the standardizations and API across VR, input is still like the Wild West because they're still trying to figure out. The HMD with the device and those specs seem to be pretty locked down. They know they have to be low latency. They know the position is pretty well expected. For what that is, but there's going to be things like eye tracking, there's going to be new features that as virtuality starts to continue to develop, there's going to be, first it's going to hit on the actual like consumer, the apps, but then eventually all that is going to be abstracted out into this WebVR API so that you'll be able to get access to all that stuff and make web experiences with it. So just from some shout out to some different open tools from Tony here in terms of the game engines. Sketchfab just raised like $30 million. Unreal and Unity, again, people can use that, but they're not necessarily open source tools, and the output of that isn't so, it's not the greatest because you still have to dynamically load stuff. You still have to wait for stuff to load even on the regular app, so it's not like that's a problem that's completely solved even on the consumer versions. But LVR and Little Star also have players as well, and some other shout-outs to different resources that are out there. Talk a little bit about some of the other players in this field. People are probably familiar with Second Life. The creator of that, Philip Rosedale, he's gone on and started High Fidelity, which is something to really watch because he decided to do everything that they did wrong with Second Life, try to do right with High Fidelity. So he's thinking about it in terms of like a distributed, like no centralized server farm. Everybody's going to be able to host their own, kind of like you host your own web server, you're able to host your own virtual environment. And it's really kind of building out the best, what I see right now, the vision of the metaverse of interconnecting these 3D worlds together. And so they're, instead of using like a proprietary language in Second Life, they're going to be using JavaScript. So there's a likelihood that they'll have more and more like THREE.JS or just JavaScript skills. You'll be able to take what will essentially be perhaps a wrapper that is running natively on your desktop and then be able to do more type of JavaScript there. So that's something that's still kind of developing, but something to look out for in terms of using front-end skills in VR. AltSpace VR is another social platform where they have an SDK that uses THREE.JS. So again, this is creating social situations where there's people coming together and they're using JavaScript to be able to create these 3D scenes that are interactive, and so they can create games or they can create different sort of experiences within the context of a performant VR experience. So that'll be interesting to see their integration with the WebVR is going to pull in a lot of the web developer community, and perhaps at some point that'll be pushed back out into the web. So it's a good place to prototype stuff in a very performant environment. Janus VR is another instance of you download an app, but they're creating entire web experiences with HTML markup. So you can, they have this whole, versioning. They're kind of like testing out a lot of this stuff that will eventually probably come back to the web. But again, they're doing it in a way that is performant and doing some really interesting experiences that are out there, like walking around, taking a tour of Mars, for example. X3DOM was recommended to me as something to look into as opposed to THREE.JS, and I haven't actually played around with it at all, but it's something that was recommended to check out, so that's something to keep on your radar as something that may be a little bit more friendly for the VR world. So there's a lot of challenges. Latency is still the biggest issue. Like the Google Cardboard is getting around, 60 frames per second. The thing about the Cardboard, people already have billions of phones that are out there, and more the phones are going to get more ready to be used as VR devices, but they're not quite there yet. So, they still have a lot of latency and lag, and there's a lot of stuff internally within the actual hardware that needs to be upgraded to be ready for VR. And, it's going to take a while for the tool set. If you're a developer trying to create the best experience, you're not going to go to WebVR first. You're going to go to Unity, and that's where a lot of the high-end kind of like VR developers that are making a go of it are putting their attention. There's not a lot of people that are focusing purely on WebVR, but because the performance there isn't there yet, but it'll get better. In MozVR, some links you have to download at this point, the Firefox and Chrome. There's some mailing lists and some other example code. This whole presentation, if you saw slides that had different styles, this is coming partly from Tony Parisi. He's got a book coming out on learning virtual reality, which is going to be a lot about using web technologies in VR. That should be landing in the summer. And Rudy Jacquin gave this Getting Started in VR with JavaScript at Empire.js. So that's a good talk that dives in a little bit more of the technical details if you want more information. So again, I'm Kent. I do the Voices of VR podcast. Check it out. I do a daily podcast about VR. And we've got about 6 minutes or so for questions, if you guys have any questions. Yeah?
I know you covered this a little, but do you have a prediction on whether web development or specifically WebVR will become more prominent, or do you think we'll end up with these siloed app stores where if I don't own the right headset, then I can't play any of these games.
Yeah.
And have any of these experiences.
Yeah, I think that people are already making WebVR experiences, and the ecosystem will continue to develop. And I think at this point, there's a lot of platform plays where it is more locked down than we would like to see. We have like the iPhone versus the Android model, and sometimes the iPhone model tends to win if it's more curated. So I think that's going to play out in the VR space as well. But I do think that in talking to the big players who are actually making it happen, they're changing things, and the technology is getting better and better. And the sort of the bottom of the line technology 5 years from now is going to be way better than what we have right now. So it's going to get to the point where it's going to hit that plateau where it's going to be equivalent. Already with some WebGL graphics, if you look at side by side of stuff that's rendered in the web browser versus what's on the web, it's pretty comparable. The thing that I also say is that there's going to be a little bit of the uncanny valley dynamic that's happening within VR, where if you hear of you get more and more closer to looking human-like, it's going to be creepy unless you're able to fully pull it off and make them like have perfect AI, perfect body language. It's like we have an expectation that when we see something that is that high fidelity, we want everything to be there. We want the haptics, we want everything. So there's a little bit of like, people are trying to go towards the place illusion of making it look like you're in another place and make it look super realistic, but that may actually hurt you in terms of creating a coherent experience. And so the ones that I found to be more immersive are the ones that have a stylized, cartoony look. So if you take that into consideration, you don't need to be able to drive super high fidelity graphics, but actually you may actually have some better compelling experiences that are the lower fidelity. So given that, I think it's actually, stuff on the web has a huge bright future, especially with the social component as well. Other questions? Yeah.
I've seen like you were talking about the lead notions of input device, and I've seen people using
other input devices for WebVR. I think right now the only thing I've really seen is the Leap Motion, but I'd expect that like right now it's like you have to be like in the top like 300 developers in the world to have a Vive kit. Like there's not a lot of them that are out there. And Oculus Touch, again, there's only about maybe 10 and soon to be like 200 out in the world, but that's not going to launch until next year. So those people aren't thinking about the WebVR at all. And like it'll take a while for those to kind of trickle out to do the full integrations into like the WebVR. But I'd expect that because it makes the VR experience that much more amazing, you're going to see more and more devices, but it's going to, I think, take some time for that to catch up. Yeah.
With surfing, just general surfing the internet, is it possible to use a VR device or Oculus to just like cruise Facebook and then go to 3D apps?
Yeah. So with virtual desktop, the virtual desktop is the thing that's going to like allow you to browse in a web browser in VR. Now the text is a little hard to read sometimes because the resolution isn't that great, especially in a DK2. But with the consumer release of the Oculus, the text resolution is going to get a lot better. So when that lands, I think you're going to see a lot more people using web browsers because it's going to be like having 30 to 40 screens available to you. You know, the screen real estate is just your field of view.
Or should we be watching for the browser, or should we be watching like who's developing?
Who's developing the virtual desktop? Well, I think right now you just search for virtual desktop. There's a guy, G. Goodwin. He's developing one. But I imagine that, like I said, like right now there's not like a default web browser app for all the HMDs. It's kind of like you can't run a browser in the officially supported web store. But I think eventually you will be able to. And that when those land, when you start to have like a Firefox or a Chrome app within VR, then you're going to be able to, typing is an issue, maybe speech to text will come along, but like typing is not the greatest because you can't see your keyboard. But maybe that'll improve and there'll be other devices that are out there. And so, that's sort of one of the bigger challenges. So I imagine people kind of like taking it off or they just get good at like touch typing. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is this deck online?
It's not online. I should ask the people that I took the slides from if they're okay for me remixing their slides. But I can certainly, after I get the okay from them, I'll just post it online for sure. I'm sure they'll be okay. It's the web, right, people? Remix. Other questions? I also recorded this, so I'll probably at least post that as well. So post the video. Okay, well, the launch of the virtual reality is coming, and Palmer Luckey says that it's inevitable. It's going to happen. I think that when people get a chance to try VR, they see how compelling it is, and you can do things that you can capture human experience in a way that you can't in any other medium, and because of that, it's got a lot of really compelling use cases, and it has that wow factor. So. As this starts to launch, I think you're going to be starting to hear a lot more about virtual reality. So, great. And if anybody does want to try out and did get a chance to try the experience, it's right over there. But thank you all again for coming. Thanks.